The Duke of Strafton said he pitied the man who married her. He said it before he met her at a dinner to a neighbour in a room that was quieter than he knew. By Friday he had crouched beside her drainage ditch in the early morning mud, and could not remember what he had meant by it at all. The summer of 1812 arrived in Hertfordshire, with the kind of heat that made people say things they ought not to. It was at dinner. Lady Ashvire's table set for 14 with the good silver and more candles than the room required that the Duke of Strafton first heard the name Margaret Lowe. He had been in the county 4 days long enough to find his rooms at Ashvire House tolerable to ride the perimeter of Lord Ashvire's land, and to conclude that the summer would pass slowly and without incident. Clara was to join him in a fortnight. Until then there were dinners. Edmund sat to Lady Ashvire's right as his rank required, and when the second course was cleared, and the room settled into that particular lull between remove and desert, the talk turned to the neighbourhood. "You must call on Miss Lowe," Lady Ashvire said during a moment when the footsteps of the retreating servants had left the room briefly quiet. "She is a near neighbour, and her father was a great friend of Ashvire's. The poor girl has been quite alone since March." "Not entirely alone," said Mr. Holt, who sat near enough to be Edmund's nearest companion at table, and held his wine-glass by the stem with the careful grip of a man on his third glass of the evening. "She has her ledgers, her tenants, and her solicitor, whom she summons at will and argues with on principle." Mild laughter moved around their end of the table. "Is she not to be admired for it?" said Mrs. Dorset, who sat to Holt's other side, and had the look of a woman who found him tiresome on most days and exhausting on this one. The estate did not dissolve when her father died. She saw to that herself. "Admired certainly," said Holt. "Married never. What man wants a wife who can read a balance sheet faster than he can?" More laughter echoed. Edmund did not laugh. He turned his wineglass once in his fingers and said it quietly to Holt alone, in the tone of a man making a practical observation rather than a declaration. "I pity the man who marries her." He meant it straightforwardly. A woman who had taken full command of an estate, who had apparently unseated her solicitor's authority and replaced it with her own. The arrangement of such a woman into a marriage seemed on brief consideration an exercise in unnecessary complication. He said it the way one might note that a particular horse would be difficult to stable with no malice, with no real interest at all. He forgot it before the port arrived. Lowe's Reach sat a quarter-mile east of Ashvire House, separated by a low stone wall and open pasture between. The house itself was not grand. It was square and honest, with a slate roof and windows that wanted new glazing in the east wing, and had wanted it for 2 years. Margaret knew this. It was on the list. The list lived in the ledger lived on her desk, and the desk sat in the study on the ground floor, which faced west toward Ashvire House, toward the open field, toward the darkening sky of every evening she had worked through since March. When the lamp burned in that window after nightfall, it threw its light across the pasture, visible from the upper east-facing rooms of Ashvire House as a single steady point of amber. She had been doing this since March, since the funeral, since the reading of the will, since the morning she had sat in her father's chair, and understood that the chair was hers now, and so was everything in it. Her father had held Lowe's Reach in fee simple, unentailed a point of some local curiosity and considerable good fortune, and had willed it to her outright with his solicitor named co-executor, until such time as she did not require him. She did not find it lonely, for she had decided not to find it lonely, which was close enough. On the evening of Lady Ashvire's dinner, Margaret was not at Lady Ashvire's dinner. She had declined gracefully with a note that cited an appointment with her land agent because 14 people around a table, asking her how she was managing, felt at present like a form of punishment she had not earned. She was in the study. The lamp was burning the east. Wing glazing estimate sat open beside the ledger, and she was making a notation in the margin when Mrs. Dorset arrived. Mrs. Dorset did not knock so much as she announced herself by the sound of removing her pattens on the front step, and then by the sound of her own voice telling the housemaid not to bother, she knew the way. Margaret set down her pen. "You were at Ashvire this evening," Margaret said when Mrs. Dorset appeared in the doorway. "I was." Mrs. Dorset sat down in the chair across the desk, her chair to all practical purposes worn slightly more on the left armrest where she always rested her elbow. It was 14 covers, the salmon was overdone, and Mr. Holt had too much wine before we even sat down. "As predicted," Margaret murmured. "As predicted." A pause followed. Mrs. Dorset looked at the lamp, then at Margaret. She had a way of arriving at difficult things by the root of comfortable things, and Margaret, who had known her for 11 years, could feel the approach. There was a newcomer, the Duke of Strafton. He is staying with the Ashviers for the summer. A tall man, dark, very correct in his manners when he chose to use them. I have heard he is expected. Margaret returned to her margin notation. Clara Fenwick's betrothed. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Margaret, she looked up. He made a remark. Mrs. Dorset said about you between the courses when the room was quiet. Holt was saying the usual, you know what Holt says, and Strafton joined in. He did not say it to the room, he said it to Holt, but I was sitting on Holt's other side and the room was quiet. He said he pitied the man who married you. She said it cleanly, without softening. She had decided on the way over that softening it would be a kind of condescension. I thought you should know. Not to cause you pain, only because you will meet him, and you ought to meet him with your eyes open. The margin notation was finished. Margaret set the pen down with precision. He has never met me, she said. No, he said it, on the strength of Holt's opinion and Lady Ashvier's dinner conversation. Yes. Margaret looked at the ledger. She looked at the East Wing estimate. Then she closed the ledger, which she had not planned to close for another hour at least, and folded her hands on top of it. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Mrs. Dorset nodded. She stayed another half hour, and they talked of other things, the new curate, the state of the Lofthouse Road, whether the Ashvier summer party would include dancing this year. When she left, Margaret walked her to the door and watched her carriage disappear down the lane. Then she went back to the study. She did not reopen the ledger. She sat in her father's chair and looked at the lamp in the window and thought about the kind of man who forms his judgment in someone else's words and calls it an opinion. Then she thought about the East Wing glazing because it would not think about itself. After a while she reached across and turned down the lamp. The window went dark. Edmund saw it go dark. He had not been watching for it. He had come to his rooms late after the port, after Lord Ashvier's interminable account of a property dispute in Somerset, and had stood at his east-facing window for a moment before bed, looking out across the open pasture. There was a light in the distance, a single argand lamp in a ground-floor window of the house, a quarter-mile east, burning steadily and throwing a clean beam across the field. He had looked at it for a moment before it occurred to him that the house must be Low's Reach. Lady Ashvier had mentioned the proximity at dinner. Someone was working late. He was still looking at it when it went out. He thought nothing of it and went to bed. He met her 4 days later at the gate. It was early, not yet 8, the dew still on the grass, and Edmund had ridden out before the rest of Ashvier House was awake, because he preferred his own company in the mornings, and because the east fields were pleasant at this hour, all pale light, and no conversation. The gate in the low stone wall that separated Ashvier land from Low's Reach had a latch that did not quite catch. He had noticed it on his first ride. On this morning he stopped beside it out of some idle instinct and looked through into the neighbouring field. She was already there, not near, perhaps 200 yards off at the far edge of the field, talking to a man who had the build and the leather apron of a tenant farmer. She had a notebook in one hand. She was not writing in it. She was listening, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has heard something unexpected and is deciding what to do with it. Edmund watched her for a moment without meaning to. She was not dressed for a morning call. She was dressed for a morning's work. A plain round gown in dark blue, a Spencer jacket that had seen better seasons, and half boots with actual mud on them. Her hair was up but imperfectly, one dark strand loose at the back of her neck. She did not look like a woman who had forgotten to finish dressing. She looked like a woman who had more important things to do. She turned and saw him. The distance was enough that he could not read her expression precisely, but he saw her register him a pause, a stillness, and then she said something to the farmer, brief and conclusive, and walked toward the gate. He should have ridden on, but he stayed. She came through the gate and latched it behind her with the efficient authority of someone who had latched it 10,000 times. She was perhaps 25 or a year or two more. Her eyes were grey, and they were at this moment entirely unimpressed. "You are Strafton," she said. "I am." He dismounted because it seemed rude not to. "And you are Miss Lowe? I have been meaning to call." "Have you? It was not a question. Do not trouble yourself on my account. I am generally in the fields at calling hours. So I observe." She looked at him with the directness of someone who has decided that social pretense will waste both their time. "Barleymore's drainage ditch collapsed overnight. I have 20 acres that will flood by Thursday if it isn't cleared. I have a man coming from the village at noon, and another from Redhold Farm tomorrow morning, and I need to know whether the obstruction is upstream or down before either of them arrives. And if it is upstream, which means it's on Ashvere land. A beat passed. I see, Edmund said. I imagine Lord Ashvere will be reasonable about it, he usually is, but I thought you should know since you are his guest, and he is not yet awake, and the field is closer to your morning ride than to his. She paused not for effect, but to decide whether she had said enough. She had. Good morning, Your Grace. She turned toward Lowe's Reach. Miss Lowe, she stopped. He was not sure why he had said it, but he said the first useful thing that came to him. I know something about drainage. My estate in Derbyshire floods in February without fail. If it would be helpful, I could ride along the south edge and see where the obstruction begins. She turned back. Her expression had not changed, but something in it recalibrated, a slight shift, the way a door moves when someone on the other side leans against it without opening it. It is early, she said, and you are a guest. I am an early riser, he said, and guests occasionally make themselves useful. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, The ditch runs south along the wall from the second marker. If you take the Ashvere side and I take the Reach side, we will find it faster. They found it in 40 minutes. A fall of earthen root from the wall's crumbling north section had blocked the channel at the third marker. Edmund identified it first and called across the wall. Margaret came around through the nearest gap and crouched at the edge of the ditch, without concern for her half-boots, and confirmed it. Thursday is manageable, she said, if the Ashvere side is cleared by tomorrow. I will speak to Ashvere's steward this morning. She stood and brushed her hands against each other once, a clean, practical gesture. Thank you, she said it as a fact, not a courtesy. It was useful to have two pairs of eyes. It was he agreed. She looked at him, a brief, direct look that landed, and then moved on. Good morning, Your Grace. This time she walked away and did not stop. Edmund stood at the crumbling wall and watched her go, and thought with a clarity that was faintly inconvenient times. She is nothing like what they said. He called at Lowe's Reach 3 days later, a proper call, the correct hour, with his card. She received him in the drawing room, which was a pleasant room that had clearly been her mother's room once, and had not been changed, since watercolors on the walls, a pianoforte that wanted tuning, and chairs arranged for conversation rather than display. Margaret herself was in the chair closest to the window, and she rose when he entered with the composure of a woman who had been expecting him and had decided to be civil about it. Your Grace, this is kind. The ditch is cleared, he said. I thought you would want to know. Ashvere's steward sent word yesterday. I am grateful. She gestured toward the chair across from hers. Will you sit? He sat. She poured tea with the same economy of motion she had used for everything he had observed her. Do no flourish, no performance. Lady Ashvere tells me your betrothed arrives next week, Margaret said. A fortnight. You must be looking forward to it. He said yes, which was the correct answer, and which had the particular quality of a door closed at normal speed. Nothing slammed, nothing forced. Margaret heard it. She was not sure what it meant. She handed him his tea and looked out the window for a moment at the field beyond, where one of her men was working along the newly cleared ditch. The lamp was on the sill. She had moved it there this morning for some routine reason and not moved it back. She set it on the desk now without comment. How long have you been at Lowe's Reach, he asked. All my life, and alone since March. Since March. She looked at him steadily. You are going to ask how I manage. I was not, he said. I can see how you manage. I was going to ask something else entirely. She waited. Whether you miss him, Edmund said. Your father. The room was quiet. Outside, a wood pigeon called twice and stopped. Yes, she said simply, finally. Not the way people usually said it, with apology or with the expectation of comfort, but as a plain answer to a plain question. He nodded once. He understood that she did not want to be consoled, and he did not try to console her. They talked for another 20 minutes about the estate, not because he asked about it, but because she mentioned the east wing glazing almost by accident, and then continued, because he seemed genuinely interested in the structural question. He had spent 3 years re-roofing Strafton Park, and had opinions about north-facing glazing that she listened to without either dismissing them or deferring to them, which was, he found, a more interesting response than either. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door herself. The housemaid had apparently been dispatched elsewhere. At the threshold, she paused, and he had the sense that she was deciding whether to say something. She said it. You did not have to come about the ditch. No, he agreed, I did not. She looked at him with those grey eyes that gave very little away and said, Then why did you? He did not have a ready answer. He looked for one and did not find it. So he said, "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure." She nodded as though that were the answer she had expected, or perhaps the only honest answer she would have trusted. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." He walked back to Ashvere House and found that the return journey felt longer than it had on the way. The lamp was burning again that night. He saw it from his east-facing window without trying to. Or so he told himself as he stood looking out before bed, a single, steady light amber against the dark, a quarter-mile across the open pasture. She was still working either that or she had simply forgotten to put it out. He turned away from the window and went to bed and did not examine the distinction. Clara Fenwick's letter arrived on a Tuesday and said she would be another week still. Her mother was unwell, nothing serious, but she could not leave until there was improvement. Edmund read the letter twice, wrote a reply that was warm and careful, and spent the rest of the morning with a faint sense of something he declined to examine. He rode to the gate that afternoon. Margaret was not there. The field was empty, the gate latched. He stood for a moment, which was foolish, and then rode south along the wall toward the Ashvere tenant cottages, which was a more defensible reason for the excursion. He met her coming back. She was on foot coming up the lane from the direction of the village, and she carried a wrapped parcel under one arm, and had the focused expression of someone whose mind was still on whatever she had just left. She saw him, and the expression shifted not to warmth, not to coldness, but to something more precise. "Your Grace." She fell into step, which is to say she continued walking, and he turned his horse to walk beside her. "Were you looking for something I was riding? You were standing at the gate." He paused. "Yes. The gate is on the border of Ashvere land. There is no particular reason to stand at it." She said this without accusation, only as an observation of fact. "I was seeing whether the ditch held after the rain," he said. She glanced up at him, a brief, considered glance. "It did. I checked this morning. I know I could see it from the lane." "Then you did not need to stop at the gate." "No." They walked in silence for a moment. The lane was narrow here, the hedge high on both sides, and the afternoon had gone golden thick with the sound of bees. "What is in the parcel?" he asked. "A book from the circulating library in Miro. I ordered it 6 weeks ago, and it has finally arrived." What book? She told him it was a work of natural history, a recent edition on the classification of field plants. She said it with no particular self-consciousness, which he found more interesting than if she had. "You study botany, I study what grows on my land," she said, "which requires a name for it." A pause fell. "People find it unusual for a woman." "People find you unusual altogether," he said, and then heard himself say it, and had the grace to look faintly uncomfortable. She stopped walking. He stopped his horse. She looked up at him with an expression he could not categorize, not offended, not amused. Something in between with a hard edge underneath. "I am aware," she said, "of me." He said nothing. She held his gaze for a moment, then continued walking. He fell in beside her again. They did not speak for the rest of the lane. At the turning to Low's Reach, she paused the parcel under her arm and looked back at him with an expression that had closed somewhere in the last 2 minutes. "The ditch will hold," she said. "You need not check it again." She went in. The door closed. Edmund rode back to Ashvere House. He was not in a good temper, which was his own fault, and he knew it. That evening, he stood at his window and looked east, and the lamp was burning. He watched it for longer than he had intended. The village assembly was held on the last Friday of the month in the room above the White Hart, and it was attended by everyone who was anyone in a radius of 4 miles and several people who were no one in particular but liked dancing. Edmund went because Lord Ashvere went, and it would have been peculiar not to. Margaret was there. He did not see her immediately. He was across the room talking to Mr. Holt, who was saying something about the shooting season, when he saw her come in with Mrs. Dorset, unhurried, a little late, in a gown the colour of sage that was simple and did not try to be otherwise. He noticed something he had not noticed before the room noticed her, not with warmth but with the sideways attention of a society that has categorized someone and is checking to make sure the category still holds. 2 women near the wall murmured. A man near the card tables looked up and then deliberately looked away. Margaret noticed none of it, or she noticed all of it, and had decided years ago not to let on. She was talking to Mrs. Dorset. She had a glass of lemonade, and she did not look around the room with the eager calculation of someone hoping to be seen. She looked at whoever she was talking to fully, and nowhere else. Edmund found himself watching her when he should have been listening to Holt. They crossed paths near the end of the first hour between dances. She was moving toward the far wall and he was moving in no particular direction, which meant they arrived at the same point at the same time, and there was no graceful way to avoid it. "Miss Lowe, Your Grace." She was carrying her lemonade still. He noticed, no dance card. "Are you enjoying yourself tolerably?" He fell into step beside her, which they had apparently established as a pattern. "You are not dancing." "I have not been asked." He nearly said something about that, the why of it, which he suspected was not for lack of admiration, but for a surplus of local caution. He did not say it. Instead, he said, "Would you like to be?" She looked at him. "I am asking," he said. "Would you like to dance, Miss Lowe?" She studied him for a moment, with that grey-eyed directness that he had begun to find he could not anticipate. "You are betrothed to a woman who is not present. Dancing is not a declaration. In this village," she said, "dancing with a duke is approximately 12 declarations. Then you may correct them all tomorrow morning." A pause, quite a long one. He waited. "One dance," she said. It was a country dance, energetic and impersonal in its structure, which allowed for exactly 2 moments of proximity and 1 exchange of hands. He was aware of her throughout, not in the way of a man watching a woman he is trying to impress, but in the way of a man who has been paying attention to someone for 3 weeks and finds that he cannot stop. When the dance ended, she stepped back and dipped her chin. "Thank you." She went back to Mrs. Dorset. He did not ask her again. He looked for the lamp that night when he returned, and it was burning in the west-facing window of the Reach, a steady point of amber light in the open field, and he stood at his window a moment longer than he needed to before he turned away. Clara arrived on a Wednesday. She came in the Fenwick carriage, which was newer and better sprung than the Strafton travelling coach, and she descended from it in the Ashvere House drive with the composure of a woman who has spent 12 hours in a carriage and intends to give nothing away. She was fair and fine-featured, and she greeted Edmund with the warmth of a long attachment, a hand on his arm, a real smile, a brief pressure of familiarity. She was, he thought, genuinely glad to see him. He was glad to see her too. He held her hands and asked after her mother, and meant the question. Clara was not a woman he had ever been able to be indifferent to. That was not the problem. The problem was something he had not yet allowed himself to name, and which he intended to continue, not naming because naming it changed everything. "You look well," Clara said, studying him. "The country agrees with you." "It does. Lady Ashvere has written to me of a Miss Lowe, a neighbour. She says you have been very attentive." He kept his face easy. "There was a matter with a drainage ditch. She is a capable woman in a difficult situation. Being useful seemed useful." Clara looked at him for a moment, with the clear, quiet attention she had always had, which had always been one of the things he admired about her. "Of course," she said, and said no more. Margaret met Clara Fenwick 4 days after she arrived at Lady Ashvere's morning coffee. She had known she would meet her eventually. She had told herself it made no difference. She had believed herself up until Clara walked in. She was lovely, unaffectedly lovely, which was worse than if she had been calculating about it. She moved through the Ashvere drawing room with a natural ease, and she spoke to everyone with the warmth of a woman who liked people and had never had a reason not to. She was good. Margaret, watching her, felt a kind of cold clarity settle in her chest. He had chosen this woman before he knew what he was choosing, and the woman was not wrong for him. That was the trouble. Clara Fenwick was not the obstacle in this story. She was simply the person who had arrived first. Edmund was there too. He had come with Clara, they had walked up together, and he was across the room talking to Lord Ashvere. He had looked at Margaret once when she came in, a look she felt before she found it. She did not hold it. Clara found her near the window. "Miss Lowe," she said, "I have wanted to meet you. Edmund speaks of you." "Does he?" Margaret said pleasantly. "He says you run Lowe's Reach entirely on your own, and do it better than most men would." He said it as a compliment. Edmund is not a man who compliments carelessly. Clara looked at her with transparent curiosity and something else, something attentive. The drainage ditch, yes. He was very helpful. He would be. He is practical when he chooses to be. Clara glanced across the room at him, something in her expression, not unhappy, not unsatisfied, but a little far away. "We have been engaged 4 years, did you know?" "That I did not." "A long time." She said it with a smile that was entirely sincere and faintly complicated. "He was 21 when our fathers arranged it. I was 18. We liked each other very well then." A pause fell. "We still like each other well." Margaret said nothing. She was aware that this conversation was more honest than it needed to be. Clara looked at her steadily. You heard what he said about you before he met you. Margaret held her ground. I did. I thought so. Clara was quiet for a moment. He would not have said it now. No, Margaret agreed. I do not think he would. Clara looked at her with an expression that was too clear and too knowing to be comfortable, and then she looked back across the room at Edmund, who had at some point turned and was watching them, both of them, with an expression Margaret could not read from this distance. It is a very fine morning, Clara said, as pleasantly as if they had been discussing the weather from the start. Shall we join the others? They joined the others. Edmund did not come across the room. Margaret did not look at him again. She walked home alone. Mrs. Dorset had offered her carriage, but Margaret wanted the air, the road, and the 20 minutes of uncomplicated silence. She took the lane which wound along the south edge of her own land, and she passed the gate in the wall, the one with the latch that did not quite catch, and she did not stop, because there was nothing to stop for and no one there. She walked the length of the lane through the gate of Low's Reach up to the house, and straight to the study. She sat down at the desk and opened the ledger. The East Wing glazing estimate was still there. She had been putting off the decision for 2 weeks, waiting on a second opinion from a man in Red Holt who had done similar work, who had said he would write, and had not yet written. She looked at it now, made the decision, and wrote the instruction. She wrote the letter to the Red Holt man, telling him his second opinion was no longer required. She closed the ledger. She sat for a moment, looking at the lamp on the sill, which was not yet lit. It was still afternoon, still light enough, and she thought about Clara Fenwick's face and the way she had said, "We still like each other well," which was not the BV. Same as times we love each other times, and they both knew it. She thought about what she had said to herself when Mrs. Dorset had told her Edmund's remark that he had made his judgment from other people's words and called it an opinion. She had thought it coldly and correctly, and she stood by it. She thought about the man who had crouched beside a drainage ditch at 7 o'clock in the morning without being asked, and had asked about her father with the directness of someone who wanted an honest answer, and had asked her to dance in a village assembly room, knowing perfectly well what it would look like, and had watched her from across a room this morning with an expression she had refused to read. None of it meant what it might mean in different circumstances. He was betrothed. He was honorable. He would not act against his honor, and she would not wish him to. She lit the lamp, not because it was dark yet, but because she was tired and the light made the study feel like itself, and she had work to do. The letter from Edmund came the next morning, not a call, a letter, a single page in a clear hand delivered by one of the Ashvere footmen. Miss Lowe, I have been told the Red Holt glazier was recommended by my own estate manager, who used him in Derbyshire 4 years ago, and found him reliable. His name is Septon. If you have not yet engaged him, his address is enclosed. If you have already made other arrangements, disregard this entirely. Yours, Strafton. That was all. She read it twice. She looked at the address enclosed, which was written in the same clear hand. She had just sent the letter telling Septon his opinion was not required. She would have to unsend it, which meant writing another letter, which was entirely the wrong use of the morning. She wrote the letter. She did not write back to Edmund. There was nothing to say that was safe to say, and she had learned at some cost not to speak when silence was the more honest option. She put his letter in the top drawer of the desk and went to see about the glazing. He found her at the gate 4 days later, not on purpose or not entirely on purpose. He was riding east again in the early morning, and she was there leaning on the top bar of the gate in a way that suggested she had come out for air rather than any errand, which was new. She had the natural history book. "Good morning," he said. She looked up. Whatever she had been thinking, she put it away cleanly. "Good morning." He dismounted. He did not examine why. "Septon, he will come next week." He was very reasonable. A pause. "Thank you for the address. It was nothing, it was useful." She looked at him and said with a care that told him she had chosen the words, "You have been frequently useful." He heard what she meant. He said, "I know." Neither of them said anything for a moment. The field behind her was bright with early sun. She had her finger in the book at the place she had been reading, and she had not opened it again. He wanted with a precision that was entirely new and entirely inconvenient to know what page she was on. "How is Miss Fenwick?" Margaret asked. "Well, she is happy in the country. She is a very pleasant woman." A silence fell, not hostile, but the kind that has weight, because neither person is willing to add to it. "Strafton," she said. His name, not his title, his name which she had never used before, and then she stopped. "Yes." She looked at the gate bar, at the book, at nothing in particular. "This is—" She did not finish it. She shook her head once very slightly. He knew what times this times was. He knew what she had started to say. and he could not in good conscience finish it for her because finishing it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant looking directly at something he was not entitled to look at. Yes, he said, because she deserved honesty if nothing else. I know. She looked up at him for a moment, her face entirely undefended, and he saw what was there, and she let him see it, and then she closed it quietly. "Good morning, Edmund," she said. She pushed off from the gate and went back toward the house, the book closed under her arm. He stayed at the gate and watched her go, and did not call after her, because there was nothing he could say that he was free to say. That evening the lamp burned late in its east-facing window. He stood at his east-facing window for a long time without turning away. He went to Clara that night, not that night, the following evening after dinner, when the Ashviers had retired and the house was quiet. He found her in the small sitting room she had taken as her own, reading in the lamplight that turned her fair hair to gold. She looked up when he came in. She did not look surprised. "Edmund," she said. He sat down across from her. He looked at his hands. He had been turning this over for 3 days and had not found a way to say it that was not a wound, and so he said it plainly. "Clara, I believe that we both know that something has changed." She put her book down. She was quiet for a moment. "Between us, I do not know how to say this, without it sounding like an excuse. It is not intended as one. I know." She looked at him steadily. "I have known for some time, Edmund, not since Miss Lowe before. I have been waiting to see if you would say it yourself, or whether I would have to." A pause. "I had rather it were you." He looked up. "I'm sorry. Don't be," she said it without coldness. "I am a little sad, which is not the same thing. We were very young. I think we chose each other because we were sensible and compatible, and everyone expected it. I do not think either of us chose each other because we could not imagine choosing otherwise." He said nothing. It was true. "I will tell my mother it was mutual," Clara said, "which is true enough. She will not like it. My family's solicitor will have something to say about it as well. You should expect to hear from him." She said it plainly, without apology. "A 4-year engagement is not broken without consequence." "I know that. Then you know what you are choosing." She folded her hands in her lap. "The gossip will be unkind to you. The legal matter may be costlier still. My mother is not a woman who accepts things quietly." "I know. Then you have chosen." She looked at him for a long moment, and her expression held something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but sat between them, perfectly honest. "I hope she is worth it." He did not answer. He did not need to. He left the room, walked the length of the corridor to his own, and stood at his window. The lamp was burning in the east, steady, solitary, and very bright. He looked at it for a long time. The news moved through the village in the way. All news moved through that village, not like a wave which implies a single direction, but like weather arriving from everywhere at once, and settling into every corner before anyone could say precisely when it had begun. By Thursday morning, the word was that the Duke of Strafton had broken his engagement to Miss Clara Fenwick. By Thursday afternoon, the word was that he had done so in a fit of temper. By Friday, the word was that Miss Fenwick had broken it herself on account of his behavior. By Saturday, the word had divided cleanly into 2 camps, those who pitied Clara and those who thought Clara had done rather well to be rid of a man who was clearly cold-natured. Both camps agreed without requiring any evidence that the whole business reflected poorly on someone. By the end of August, the matter had reached London. Edmund knew it had. 2 invitations he would ordinarily have received did not come, and Lady Ashvia received 3 letters from acquaintances in town that she did not share the contents of, though her expression at breakfast on the days they arrived said, "Enough." The legal matter moved faster than the gossip. A letter arrived from Fenwick's family solicitor on the Friday, 2 pages precise and unpleasant, outlining the basis for a claim of breach of promise. Edmund read it at the library desk in Ashvia House, with Lord Ashvia standing at the window, pretending not to be listening, and he read it a second time, because the first reading had not fully encompassed the scope of the financial demand. It was by any measure a serious number. He wrote back the same day through his own solicitor in London, accepting liability and requesting terms. He did not discuss the amount with Lord Ashvia. He did not discuss it with anyone. He folded the letter, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, and went for a long ride in the direction that had nothing to do with the gate in the stone wall, and which nonetheless ended there. The field was empty, the gate was latched. He stood at it for a moment and then rode back. Margaret heard about the broken engagement from Mrs. Dorset, which was becoming a pattern she did not entirely welcome. He ended it himself, Mrs. Dorset said in the study in her chair on the Friday morning. That much I have from the Ashvere housekeeper who had it from Lady Ashvere directly. Miss Fenwick departed yesterday. She was by all accounts perfectly composed. I am glad, Margaret said. She meant it. She was looking at the ledger without reading it. There will be legal consequences, Mrs. Dorset added, because she was a woman who believed in the full account. A 4-year engagement broken by the man Miss Fenwick's family will have grounds. The settlement could be considerable. I know what breach of promise costs. I thought you might. A pause. Margaret, do not. I have not said anything. You are about to say something. She set down her pen. Whatever you are about to say, I would ask you to not say it. Mrs. Dorset was quiet for a moment, which was not her natural state, and cost her something. Then she said very carefully, he broke his engagement. 4 years of obligation, a legal and financial liability he walked into with full knowledge, and he did it. He knew what it would cost him when he did it. Yes, Margaret said, that is all I intended to say. I understand. She picked her pen back up. I also understand that it does not change what he said about me before he knew me. It does not undo the fact that he stood in a room full of people and decided on no information whatsoever that I was a woman to be pitied. She paused. Understanding a thing is not the same as forgiving it. No, Mrs. Dorset agreed, it is not. Margaret wrote a notation in the margin of the ledger. It was the wrong notation. She saw it immediately, struck through it, and wrote the correct one. She did not look up. He is not called, she said. It has been 2 days. I know how long it has been. Mrs. Dorset left an hour later. Margaret sat in the study alone and looked at the lamp on the sill unlit in the late morning light, and thought about what she had said times. Understanding is not the same as forgiving. She thought about a man crouching beside a drainage ditch at 7 in the morning. She thought about the way he had asked about her father plainly, without the elaborate sympathy people usually deployed, which was a kind of performance she had always found exhausting. She thought about one dance at the White Hart and the word times, approximately times, and the fact that he had throughout all of it never once looked at her, the way people usually looked at her, with either dismissal or the particular weariness of those who found her inconvenient. He had looked at her as though she was someone worth looking at. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the west field and the stone wall and the stand of pasture beyond which Ashvere House sat in its grounds. She had not forgiven him. She was also aware that she was constructing a case for a defense she had not yet been asked to make, which was a form of dishonesty she disliked in herself. She went back to the ledger. He called on Saturday. She was in the kitchen garden when he came, not gardening but examining the south wall, which had a crack in the mortar she wanted assessed before winter. The housemaid found her there and delivered the card, and Margaret looked at it for a moment, with the card in her soil-dusted fingers, and said, "Tell His Grace I will be in directly." She went in. She did not change. She came to the drawing room, in the plain dark gown she had been wearing all morning, with mud on the fingers of her right hand, that she had wiped but not entirely removed, and she thought times, let him see this. Let him see what he said was pitied. He was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the kitchen garden she had just come from. He turned when she came in. He looked like a man who had not slept well. "Miss Lowe, Your Grace." She did not gesture to a chair. She stood in the middle of the room, looked at him, and waited. He said, "I am aware that I am not entitled to much of your time." "Sit down," she said, because making him stand seemed like cruelty dressed as principle. He sat. She sat across from him. She did not pour tea. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them made any pretense at preamble. "I owe you an apology," Edmund said. "I said something before I met you that was wrong. Not merely wrong in retrospect, because I now know you to be different from what I assumed. Wrong at the time because I had no basis for assuming anything at all. And I said it anyway in company, and I cannot pretend it was without consequence." She held his gaze. "No, you cannot. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am not certain I have earned the right to ask for it." He paused. "I am asking whether you will hear me." "I am hearing you. What I said, I meant it practically, as a man observing a situation from the outside. It did not occur to me that the woman at the center of that situation was a person with her own account of herself, which was likely far more accurate than mine." He looked at his hands briefly. "I had been here 4 days. I knew nothing about you. I said it because Holt was saying worse, and I thought I was being moderate." He looked up. "That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and there is a difference." "There is," she said. "I know you have been told things about me in the last 4 days that are not flattering. I am aware of what the village is saying. Are you aware of the legal matter I have already engaged my solicitor on it?" His voice did not change. "I do not raise it for credit. I raise it because you asked, and I will not be less than honest with you." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the lamp on the sill. It was sitting there in daylight, unlit, and she thought, "Times I have been burning it every night for weeks, and I did not examine why." She examined it now. "You have been honest with me," she said, "more honest than most people trouble to be. That is not nothing." "No," he said, "I did not think you would want anything less." "I don't," she looked back at him. I cannot simply say that it is forgotten. It is not forgotten. It may be set aside in time if there is reason to set it aside." He looked at her carefully. "Is there reason?" She held his gaze for a long moment. The morning was quiet around them. Beyond the window, her kitchen garden sat in the June light, with its cracked south wall and everything in it that was hers and hers alone. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. "Then I will wait," he said, "until you do." He stood, and she walked him to the door as she always did. On the threshold he paused, which she had begun to expect from him. "Miss Lowe," he looked at her with the full, clear directness he had used exactly once before the morning at the gate, when she had told him about the flooded acres, and he had dismounted without being asked. "For what it is worth, I do not pity the man who marries you." She held that for a moment. "No," she said, "I rather think you don't." He left. She stood in the open doorway and watched him go, and then she closed the door and leaned her back against it for one moment in the empty hall, her eyes closed, her hands flat against the wood. Then she went back to the kitchen garden and the south wall and the crack in the mortar, because it would not assess itself. The days that followed had the quality of held breath. He called twice more that week, both proper calls, both of the correct duration, both conducted in the drawing room with the pianoforte that wanted tuning and the chairs arranged for conversation. He did not push. She discovered a man who was very good at not pushing, which was far more effective than pushing would have been. They talked about the estate, the east wing glazing, which Septon had confirmed was straightforward, 2 days' work at most. About Derbyshire, the re-roofing of Stratton Park, which had taken 3 winters, and a great deal of arguing with a surveyor who kept insisting the problem was the gutters, when the problem was manifestly the joists. About books, she was halfway through the natural history volume and had found 3 species in the East Field. She had been misidentifying for 2 years, which she found both mortifying and satisfying. He listened to her entirely without the half-attention men sometimes deployed when women spoke, the attention that was really just patience, waiting for its turn. He listened as though what she said had information in it that he wanted. She found she was no longer building a case for a defense. She was no longer entirely sure what she was doing, only that she was doing it, and that it felt less dangerous than it had 2 weeks ago. It was Mrs. Dorset who forced the moment, not intentionally, or not entirely. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, as she arrived unannounced and confident of her welcome, to find Edmund's horse already at the Lowes Reach gate, and Edmund himself in the drawing-room with Margaret. They were not sitting particularly close. There was nothing that could be pointed to, but the room had a quality to it, a held-breath quality, the same one the preceding weeks had carried, but distilled now into this specific afternoon, this specific light, these 2 specific people who had stopped talking when the door opened and were now looking at Mrs. Dorset with the expressions of people interrupted mid-sentence, except that neither of them had been speaking. "Oh," said Mrs. Dorset. She took in the room with the clear attention of a woman who has been waiting for this development for some time and is not sorry to have arrived at it. "I have called at a wrong moment." "Not at all," Margaret said. "I think perhaps I have a brief pause. I think, in fact, that I have arrived when someone needed to say something that has not yet been said, and now there is a witness which makes it much harder to leave the room without saying it." Dorothy Margaret said with quiet warning. "I am simply observing Mrs. Dorset said, and sat down in her armrest-worn chair with the composure of a woman who has no intention of leaving, that it is a very fine afternoon, and I believe His Grace had something to say. Silence fell. Edmund looked at Mrs. Dorset. He looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at the lamp on the sill unlit in the afternoon, sitting there like a question she had not yet answered. He stood across the room to the window where the lamp sat, and Margaret's chair was near enough to the window that this put him closer to her than he had been all afternoon. Close enough that she looked up. He looked at her. "Miss Lowe," he said. "Margaret." Her name in his voice was different from her name in anyone else's. She had known this for 3 weeks. "I am not a man who speaks before he is certain," he said. I want you to know that I am certain. I have been certain for some time, and I have been waiting because you asked me to wait, and because you were right to ask, and because I did not want to offer you something you would receive as pressure." He paused. "But I think you are certain too, and I think you have been waiting for yourself to permit it." She held his gaze, her hands still in her lap. "This estate," he said, "this study, this lamp, you burn until midnight every night, when you are working, which I can see from my window at Ashvia, which I have been looking for every single evening since the first week I was here." He stopped. "I am not asking you to leave it. I am not asking you to become something other than what you are. I am asking whether there is room in any of this for me." The room was entirely still. Margaret looked at him. She looked at the lamp. She thought about the night she had turned it out, deliberate cold, after Mrs. Dorset had delivered the news of his remark. She thought about lighting it again 3 days later, not because the darkness had grown comfortable, but because she had refused to let his opinion reshape her life. She thought about what it meant that she had looked for his horse at the gate every morning for a fortnight. "You see the lamp from your window," she said, "every night. Then you know what hours I keep. I do. And you have seen the mud on my hands and the state of my half-boots, and the fact that I spend more time in the fields than in drawing rooms. And you have heard me argue about joists and drainage and the price of east-facing glazing. I have. And you are certain—" "I am certain," he said, "that I would rather argue about joists with you than speak pleasantly about anything else with anyone." Mrs. Dorset made a small sound that was not quite a cough. Margaret stood. She was close to him now, close enough to see the careful tension in his face, the control of a man who has said the honest thing and is waiting to learn whether it is enough. She put her hand on his arm once lightly. "Edmund," she said, and then, because there was no good speech left to make, because everything that needed to be said had been said already in the preceding weeks, by drainage ditches and lamplight, and one dance at the White Hart, and a letter about a glazier, and all the accumulated weight of 2 people who could not look away. She leaned forward slightly, and he met her, and he kissed her. It was quiet, it was not brief. It was the kind of kiss that is really a conclusion, the last sentence of something that has been building toward articulation for a long time, and has finally found its words. Mrs. Dorset looked at the ceiling, then at the wallpaper, then with great resolve at her own lap. When they separated, Margaret's hand was still on his arm. Edmund was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open, something relieved, as though he had been carrying a weight and had been permitted at last to set it down. "Well," said Mrs. Dorset to the wallpaper. Margaret looked at her. Edmund looked at her. There was a beat of silence, and then something Margaret had not allowed herself in some weeks, a real laugh, not performed amusement, not the polite variety, a real one, sudden and brief, and entirely unguarded. Edmund's expression shifted. She had not seen him laugh before either. It suited him considerably. "You are impossible," Margaret told Mrs. Dorset. "I have been called worse," Mrs. Dorset said with great satisfaction, "and I was right." He said also, and without being asked, that Low's Reach would be settled in trust for their children. He had arranged a formal power of attorney, the terms of which his London solicitor had drafted, and which gave Margaret legal standing to act on his behalf in all matters pertaining to the estate, tenants, accounts, improvements, leases. The arrangement was unconventional. He did not care. She looked at him for a long moment after he said that last part. "You thought of it before asking me," she said. "I thought of what mattered to you," he said. "I would rather start there." She said yes. Not immediately. She let 2 full breaths pass after the question, not to be cruel, but because she wanted to be certain she was choosing it, rather than surrendering to it. She was choosing it. She said yes. He gave her his grandmother's ring, a sapphire, square cut, practical in shape. It fit her hand as though it had been made for it. She kept the lamp he asked her to. "It is how I knew when you were working," he said, "and when you were not. I would rather not lose the information." She looked at him. "You are a strange man." "I have been told," he said. They were to be married in the spring, April, they agreed, which gave Edmund's solicitor time to manage what needed managing, and gave the county time to form and exhaust its opinions before the wedding required attending. The village had opinions about this, which it expressed in the usual way through Mrs. Alderton at the mercer's, through the curate's wife, through the assembled conversation of the White Hart on market days, and the opinions were various. Some found it too quick, too convenient, too arranged around the wreckage of a prior arrangement. Some found the Duke's choice baffling. Why a woman like that in a house like that, when the Stratton title could have commanded better? Margaret was aware of all of it. She found it neither devastating nor irrelevant. She walked through the village as she had always walked through it, straight-backed and purposeful, and she nodded to the people who nodded to her, and did not alter her pace for the ones who didn't. Edmund, who had anticipated some of this, had not anticipated her precise quality of indifference to it. He told her so. "I stopped performing feelings for this village's benefit some time before my father died," she said. "I do not intend to start again. I would not ask you to." "Good," she looked at him. "Will it trouble you, the talk?" "No," he considered. "Derbyshire has its own opinions about everything. We will weather them together." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to the glazing specification Septon had sent that morning. He watched her work for a moment and thought that he had been right. This was more interesting than any conversation he could imagine having with anyone else. The settlement with the Fenwick family was concluded in February, after 6 months of correspondence between London solicitors and one very unpleasant letter from Clara's mother that Edmund read once and did not show Margaret. Edmund's solicitor wrote with the final figure on a Wednesday. Edmund read the letter, folded it, and placed it in the correspondence file without comment. The amount was significant enough to require the quiet sale of a smaller parcel of land to the north of the Stoughton estate, arranged through his solicitor and concluded before September. He did not resent it. It was the cost of honesty arrived at too late, and debts of one's own making did not benefit from resentment. He told Margaret because there were to be no subjects between them. He told her the figure and he told her about the land. She did not ask him to justify either. She asked instead whether the settlement had been concluded fairly for Clara, which was, he thought, precisely the right question. "Yes," he said, her solicitor was thorough. "Good," she said, and meant it. Clara Fenwick wrote to her in March. Margaret received the letter at breakfast, recognized handwriting she had not encountered before, but could not have mistaken for anyone else's, and opened it without delay. "Dear Miss Lowe, I write to you directly because I find I prefer it to the alternative, which would be to say nothing and allow both of us to wonder. I want you to know that I do not hold what has occurred against you. I want you to know it not as a politeness, but as a fact, because you are, from what I observed, a woman who prefers facts. Edmund did not fall out of love with me for your sake. He did not fall out of love with me at all, precisely. Rather, he and I were always an arrangement that suited us, before we understood what we might require of a marriage. I understood it before he did. I am not sorry that circumstances brought him to understand it too. He is an honest man, honorable to a fault, and sometimes difficult on account of it, but honest. He will make you a very fine husband if you can bear the occasional stubbornness. I am told you run your estate with great competence. I hope Stoughton Park will not give you too much trouble. I understand the East Wing is notorious. With my sincere regards, Clara Fenwick." Margaret read the letter twice. Then she sat it down and looked out the window for a moment at the east field in the August morning, and thought about what it cost a person to write a letter like that. She wrote back the same day. "Dear Miss Fenwick, thank you. I shall keep the letter. I understand the East Wing is indeed notorious. I have dealt with worse. Yours sincerely, Margaret Lowe." She gave the letter to the housemaid to post, then went to find Edmund, and read him both letters in full because she had decided early on that there would be no subjects between them, and intended to maintain it. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "She is a remarkable woman," he said. "Yes," Margaret folded both letters with equal care. "You chose well once. You simply chose wrong in a different sense." She looked at him. "I think she will be all right. I think so too." He paused. "And us?" She looked at him with the full, clear directness she had stopped hiding. "I think she said that we will be considerably better than all right." He took her hand. She let him. They married on the 3rd of April 1813 at the village church, which held 38 people if some of them stood, and which held 41. On this occasion, because the Vane cousins had come from Buckinghamshire unexpectedly, and there was nothing to be done about it. Margaret wore her mother's pearls and a gown in ivory silk that was not new. She had repurposed a length of fabric she had bought 2 years ago for a different occasion that had never materialized, and the dressmaker in Miro had done remarkable things with it. She looked Mrs. Dorset, told her extremely well. I know Margaret said not from vanity but from honest assessment. Lord Ashvere came to offer his arm at the church door, as had been arranged. Margaret had considered refusing him, had stood at her bedroom window that morning, turning it over the weight of walking in alone, set against the weight of what it would cost. She was not a woman who refused gestures out of pride when the cost fell on others. She took his arm. She walked down the aisle of the small church with its smell of stone and old wood and harvest flowers, and she did not look at the assembled 41 with any particular expression. She looked at Edmund, He was watching her come. He had the look she had seen on him exactly once before, open something relieved, and she thought walking toward him. He is a man who will always look at me like that. I am going to have to accustom myself to it. She arrived beside him. You took Lord Ashvire's arm, he said very quietly before the service began. I considered not to, she said. I decided the principle was not worth the cost to him. He held out his hand. She took it. The vicar began. They went to Strafton Park in October. The journey from Hertfordshire took 2 days by carriage, one night at the posting inn at Loughborough, where the beds were adequate and the supper was not, and where Margaret spent the evening hour before sleep at the small writing desk in their room going over the Strafton Park household accounts. Edmund's steward had sent ahead. She had asked for them 3 weeks before the wedding. Edmund had arranged for them to be sent. He watched her read from across the room in the firelight and said nothing until she set the last page down. Well, he said, the coal delivery is wrong for a house of that size, she said, and someone has been overpaying for linen for at least 4 years. She looked up. But the land figures are sound. Your steward knows what he is about. High praise, it is accurate, she said, and went to bed. Derbyshire received them the following afternoon with the kind of weather that could only be called honest, grey sky, persistent rain, a wind off the hills that found the gaps in every window frame without effort. Strafton Park itself was large and cold and smelled of damp stone and something that had been lavender once and was now only memory. Margaret stood in the entrance hall on the first evening and turned slowly, taking in the plasterwork ceiling with its water stain in the northeast corner. The staircase with its worn treads and the corridor beyond that disappeared into the east wing, which was where the notorious problems lived. Edmund watched her. Well, he said again. She completed her turn. It is considerably larger than Low's Reach. It is the 4th and 7th stairs. The 4th, 7th and 9th, if I am honest. You are always honest. She looked at the ceiling. The northeast corner is damp behind the plasterwork. Not surface damp. You will need to find the entry point before the frost. I know. I will want to see the accounts. They are on the desk in the library. I had them laid out before we arrived. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was travel-worn and slightly rain-damp and making structural assessments at 7 o'clock in the evening, and she looked, he thought, precisely and exactly like herself. Good, she said. They went in. The East Wing was, as reported, notorious. Margaret spent the first 2 weeks at Strafton Park, conducting a systematic survey of it, not because Edmund's steward had not done so, but because she found that she understood buildings through her own hands and eyes, and because the steward, though competent, had a tendency to summarize problems in ways that lost the essential information. She found the water entry point in the northeast corner on the 3rd day, a failure in the lead flashing at the parapet invisible from below and apparently overlooked in the last 2 surveys. She told Edmund at dinner. Where precisely, he said. She described it. He nodded. Simcox mentioned something about the parapet in 1808. He wrote it off as surface weathering. Simcox was wrong. Simcox is frequently wrong, he looked at her. How did you find it? I went on the roof. A pause fell. Margaret. The lead was visible from the parapet walk. It took 4 minutes. It is 40 feet. I have been on roofs before. She served herself more potatoes with the composure of a woman who does not find this conversation remarkable. I will have the specification written up by Thursday. Septon, or a local man, he looked at her for a long moment, something alive and warm in his expression. Septon. And Margaret, please do not go on the roof again. If there is a structural reason not to, I will note it in the specification. The structural reason is that I would like you to remain attached to the earth. That is a sentimental reason. Yes, he said, I have them occasionally. They increase in proportion to certain attachments. She looked at him for a moment, fighting a smile and making a reasonable job of it. I will consider it. Strafton Park adjusted to her, which was the only direction available. The household had been running without a mistress for 7 years since Edmund's mother's death, and this had expressed itself in the way of large households without direction. Things were done as they had always been done, and no, one questioned whether they ought to be done differently, because there was no one to ask. Margaret asked. She sat with the housekeeper, Mrs. Grieve, in the first week, and went through the household accounts line by line, not to interrogate, but to understand. Mrs. Grieve, who had been braced for a duchess who swept in and dismantled everything, found instead a woman who read a balance sheet with the same attention she herself gave it, and who said at the end of 2 hours, the linen budget is too high. and the coal delivery is too infrequent for a house of this size. Everything else seems sound. What am I missing, Mrs. Grieve, who had been saying both of these things to herself for years without anyone to receive them, listed 3 further items. Margaret wrote them all down. By December, the east wing flashing was repaired, the coal delivery reorganized, and the linen budget reallocated to the repair of the stair treads attended to in a single morning by a carpenter from the village, who seemed faintly bewildered, to receive instructions from the Duchess directly, delivered through Edmund's authority and in Edmund's name as the law required, and as neither of them pretended otherwise. Edmund watched all of it with the attention he had been giving her since the first morning at the gate. He was happy. This was sufficiently new that he spent some time in the first months examining it to ensure it was genuine and not merely relief. He concluded it was genuine. It was quieter than he had expected. Happiness to be not a trumpet note, but a steady thing, present in particular moments, lamplight from the study she had claimed on the ground floor. Her voice from 2 rooms away giving precise instructions about something, the quality of her attention when she looked at him, and was not hiding any part of what she thought. He had not expected to be known. He found that he was. The lamp had come with her. She had packed it herself in her own trunk, wrapped in a winter petticoat. When she unpacked it in the study, she had chosen ground floor east-facing, good light in the mornings and a clear view across the parkland. She set it on the sill without ceremony. That first night, working late over the east wing specification, she lit it. Edmund saw it from the corridor. He had come downstairs for something, a book left in the drawing room, and passed the study door slightly open and saw the glow of it on the window glass. He pushed the door open. She looked up from the desk. "You brought the lamp," he said. "I brought the lamp." He looked at it for a moment and then at her. "I no longer need to look for it from across a field." No, she looked at the lamp and then at him. "Now you can simply come in." He came in, sat in the chair across the desk, his chair she had already decided, and she returned to the specification, and he read, and the lamp burned was by any honest account exactly enough. Their first child was born in July of 1814, a girl. Edmund held her in the corridor outside the bedroom door for 3 minutes, while the doctor was still with Margaret, and he looked at this small, extremely disgruntled creature who had arrived making her objections known, and felt something that would have embarrassed him to name in company. Margaret, when the doctor had gone and Edmund came in, was sitting up against the pillows with the look of a woman who has done something very hard and is not planning to make a ceremony out of it. She held out her arms. He brought the baby. She settled her, looked at her face and said, "She has your expression." "Which expression?" "The one you had at Lady Ashvire's dinner party when you thought no one was observing you." He sat on the edge of the bed. "I did not think you had ever seen me at Lady Ashvire's dinner party." "I had not, but Mrs. Dorset described it very well." She looked up at him. "She is going to make people uncomfortable, this one, I can tell already." "Good," he said. Margaret smiled, the real one, the one she did not perform. "Good," she agreed. They named her Frances. She was, as predicted, immediately and continuously inconvenient, and they were both of them entirely devoted to her. Thomas arrived in 1816. He was a placid baby which surprised everyone who knew his parents, and remained a placid child which surprised everyone further. He had Margaret's grey eyes and his father's dark hair, and a temperament that appeared to have arrived from nowhere in particular, on either side, being generally agreeable and interested in everything. "He is a great deal easier to manage than the estate," Margaret said one afternoon, watching Thomas arrange a set of wooden soldiers with methodical patience, while Francis stood over him, issuing tactical corrections he absorbed without complaint. "You love the estate," Edmund said. "I love the estate and find it difficult." She did not look away from the children. "These are not mutually exclusive." Frances, having completed her tactical assessment, announced to her brother that the left flank was entirely wrong and began repositioning it. Thomas watched her with the placid attention he gave to everything. "She's going to want to see the accounts," Margaret said, "when she is old enough. She is already doing sums on the margins of her lesson books." A pause fell. "I began at 4. My father let me see the quarterly accounts at 8. Was that helpful?" She looked at him. It was everything. She was quiet for a moment. "I should like to do the same for her if she wants it." "Then we will," he said. She nodded, satisfied. In the nursery, Frances had finished her corrections and was now explaining their strategic logic to her brother with the full confidence of someone who has never once doubted her own assessment and sees no reason to begin. By 1818, the east wing at Strafton Park was fully repaired. The household accounts were in the best order they had been in a generation, and the North Derbyshire property was yielding significantly more than it had in the preceding decade on account of a drainage improvement Edmund's steward had been suggesting for years without anyone listening, until Margaret had looked at the land figures and said simply, "Do it." Lowes Reach, held in trust for the children under Edmund's legal authority, was let to a young family from Kent. Margaret had managed the terms herself, had conducted a correspondence with the prospective tenants that lasted 6 weeks and covered the drainage situation, the recurring matter of the south boundary wall mortar, and the particular habits of the Northfield Gate with a thoroughness that the family solicitor had described in a private letter as rather more than he had anticipated from a duke's wife. She kept the right to her father's study. It was in the agreement. She went back in the spring, a 2-day carriage journey each way, Edmund at Strafton with the children, and she let herself in and sat in her father's chair, which was still her father's chair, and she opened the ledger she had left on the desk. The last notation was in her own hand, made on the morning of her wedding times. Estate review, due, April. Wall repaired to satisfaction. She closed the ledger. She sat in the quiet room for a while, the afternoon light coming through the east window, and she thought about her father and about everything that had been this house, this desk, this lamp. She had carried north in a trunk, wrapped in a winter petticoat. She was not sad. She was the particular thing that lives between grief and gratitude, which has no better name than both at once. She put on her half-boots and walked the perimeter of Lowes Reach in the spring afternoon. The east field, the south boundary, the low stone wall with its gate that still did not quite latch, and she stood at the gate for a moment and looked through at the Ashvere land, beyond at the open pasture, at the quarter-mile of field across which a lamp in a window had once been visible on clear nights. She latched the gate firmly because it always needed firmness, and walked back. Edmund came to collect her on the Friday. He made the journey from Strafton Park in the carriage 2 days down one night at Loughborough, and arrived at Lowes Reach in the mid-afternoon, to find Margaret in the kitchen garden talking to the tenant's wife about the south wall mortar, which had cracked again in the frost. He waited at the gate. She had not heard the carriage. She had her notebook out making a notation, and she had mud on the fingers of her right hand, which she would not notice until he told her. He intended to tell her not because it needed correcting, but because it was her entirely and completely her, and he had not tired of the sight of it in 6 years, and had no expectation of beginning. She looked up and saw him. He saw the moment she let herself smile, not the decision, but the moment she stopped managing the expression and allowed it to do what it wanted, which was to change everything in her face quietly and without announcement. He came through the gate and crossed the kitchen garden to her, and she looked up at him with the notebook in her hand and the mud on her fingers, and everything between them that was chosen and accumulated and real. "The mortar," she said, "I can see it from here." He took her free hand, the clean one. "Thomas has reorganized his soldiers. Francis has reorganized them back. Mrs. Grieve sends her regards and says the coal delivery arrived correctly for the first time in living memory. It should have been doing so for 2 years. It should." He looked at her. "Are you ready?" She looked back at Lowes Reach, the square, honest house, the east window of her father's study, the kitchen garden with its imperfect mortar, and its south wall crack that someone would see to before autumn. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said. They walked to the carriage together, and Margaret did not look back at the house because there was no need to. It would be there in the autumn and the spring after that, and the one after, tended and purposeful, and hers in the ways that mattered. The lamp was already home, burning in an east-facing window in Derbyshire, visible to no one but the dark. It did not need to be seen anymore. It only needed to burn. If you enjoyed this detailed transformation and reading breakdown of this classic Regency tale, please make sure to like this post and subscribe to the channel for more authentic animated story adaptations. Do you think Edmund's quick change of heart about Margaret was driven entirely by her fierce independence, or did his own sense of practical responsibility draw him to her first? Let me know your thoughts.